The app and
Play LBC.
leading Britain's conversation. This is LBC.
From Global's newsroom at 6 o'clock, the Defence Secretary says the MOD is taking steps to prevent a future data breach after thousands of Afghans were put at risk. The personal details of people seeking safety in the UK were exposed. LBC has been prevented from reporting on the story due to a super-injunction. Our political reporter Aggie Chambré has been gauging reaction from MPs who only found out about it this lunchtime.
This is so shocking. Really crazy. Another person, lots of layers to it, but on the face of it, it looks like a massive cover-up and a failure of democracy. I spoke to someone as well of cabinet minister level of this Labour government who didn't know about it as well, so just kind of really hammering that point that people did not know about that.
The Conservative leader Kemi Badenoch will be joining Ian Dale on LBC from 7 o'clock this evening. The two men who cut down the Sycamore Gap tree have been jailed for more than 4 years each. 39-year-old Daniel Graham and Adam Carruthers, who's 32, were found guilty of criminal damage in May. 3 women have been arrested on suspicion of terror offences after a van was driven into a defence factory. It happened in Edinburgh earlier. And a drought has been declared in the East and West Midlands after the driest start to the year since 1976. In the city, the FTSE 100 has closed down 59 points at 89.38. The pound buys $1.33 and €1.15. LBC weather, heavy showers lingering over central and eastern England tonight. Light rain in the southwest, but generally dry elsewhere. A low of 8 degrees. From Global's newsroom for LBC, I'm Amelia Cox.
This is LBC from Global, leading Britain's conversation. It's 6 p.m. Now, Tonight with Andrew Marr.
Good evening. Let's start tonight by thinking about the people at the heart of today's big breaking story. The Afghan volunteer soldiers, translators, office workers, support staff who helped invading British forces during the war against terrorism. Then, in 2021, we abandoned Afghanistan. We scuttled. A shameful retreat led by the Americans. Those people, our Afghans, as it were suddenly left behind in a world controlled by their deadly enemy, the Taliban. Not many choices for them. They can stay with their families and hope never to be discovered, risking, if they are, torture and death. Or they can try to get out and hope the British, whom they helped, will in turn help them. Meanwhile, some dozy civil servant working for the Ministry of Defence mistakenly releases the details of Afghans who worked with Britain. Names, contact details, phone numbers, sometimes their family members. In total, it's thought up to 100,000 people, including women and children, were put at risk of being murdered by the country's new masters. What a catastrophic betrayal. Next, perhaps recognising that, the government sets up a new route for people at risk of reprisals to come to Britain, the so-called Afghan response route. Some 18,500 people have arrived here already by this secret route, now closed. Another 5,400 are en route or have been promised they can come. Cost of the settlement, at least £800 million. Where is the money coming from? No answer. Meanwhile, a new official study has decided that those left behind are no longer at particular risk. The world has moved on and many of their names can be found elsewhere, although some may still be in danger. Now, if this is all news to you, join the club, because the government has used a so-called super-injunction, a blanket ban on information stopping even MPs knowing what happened, and which was only lifted at noon today. It did this, of course, initially to protect our Afghan allies at risk of being shot or tortured at home, but also to hide a deeply embarrassing story about migration and official incompetence before the general election and since. You should have known about this ages ago. You didn't. Here's John Healey, the Defence Secretary, speaking to the Commons this afternoon.
It may have occurred 3 years ago under the previous government, but to all those whose information was compromised, I offer a sincere apology today on behalf of the British government.
A very few news outfits were challenging this injunction in a secretive court. One of them was Global's own Newsagents podcast, whose Lewis Goodall joins me now. Lewis, can you just explain to people listening how this super-injunction worked and why they haven't heard anything for 2 years?
Well, Andrew, as you say, a super-injunction, when it is taken out, they're rare anyway, but they, to our understanding, and this was said in court, has never previously been used by government to prevent the disclosure or reporting of a story which is clearly in the public interest about its own activity. This had never happened before. It was taken out in August 2023. I was injuncted first when I approached the Ministry of Defence about this leak. At the time, as you say, although I was pretty disturbed by the idea of a government using a super-injunction, the rationale at least was clear.
You're saving lives.
They were saving lives. And yet by the time we got to the second or third hearing, 3 or 4 months later, it became clear it wasn't just about saving lives anymore. To me, it became clear it was about trying to prevent, getting to the general election, as you say, eventually getting beyond it. And look, we can discuss at length the motivations of individual ministers. We can discuss what they were trying to do. For me, what disturbs me and worries me is the idea of super-injunctions being used in this fashion in the future by future governments, something that Number 10 itself tonight has not ruled out. And in an interview with me, exclusive interview with me for the Newsagents this evening, John Healey, the Defence Secretary, although he said he would be very reluctant, would not rule out either. Well,
that is interesting. In this interview, I wonder if you were able to press John Healey on why it's a year since the election, and he has known about this presumably all the time. In fact, he knew before the election. Why it's taken so long for Labour to move on this?
Well, this is another one of the. There's so much about this, Andrew, which is mysterious. And one of the things that is mysterious is the rationale for lifting it now. Now, what John Healey would say is he commissioned a review when he came into office, led by a former civil servant called Paul Rimmer. And Paul Rimmer came back with the conclusion that actually, if the Taliban were to obtain the data set, it would no longer be as dangerous as the government previously thought. They said because the Taliban had lots of this information anyway, the Taliban didn't seem to be conducting systematic extrajudicial killings, and there was no evidence that they would do so in the future. Now, listeners might wonder, wasn't all of that known 2 years ago when the super-injunction was taken out by the previous government, or a year ago when the government came in? And indeed, it was. So again, it is something else about this extraordinary story that is deeply, deeply puzzling.
I've been speaking to one of the Afghan veterans themselves who says that, the Taliban is still hunting down and indeed killing people connected to the British forces there. So it's safer, but it's not safe. Final question, Lewis. This all came about because one official made a catastrophic mistake. Do we know what's happened to them? They've presumably been fired long ago.
Well, I don't think so, Andrew. There's a question, exactly the first question that I put to the Defence Secretary this evening, whether this person was still employed by the British government. Lots of speculation about exactly what this person was doing. He said that they are no longer working in this particular policy area around Afghanistan. Well, that's a relief. But it's clear to me from his answers that this man, this person, woman, this person, is still being employed by the British government. So we have 100,000 Afghans being put at potentially lethal risk. We've got a public bill potentially running into the billions of pounds, at the very least 800 million, and a constitutionally precedent-defying super-injunction that could have a massive effect on the way our democracy works for years to come, and not a single person, as far as we know, has lost their job over it.
Extraordinary. Lewis, thank you very much indeed. Now, as I said before, this story really comes down to the individuals involved, the people that this breach put at risk. To speak on their behalf, I was joined by a former Afghan interpreter, Rafi, who came to the UK in 2011. What was his reaction to today's news?
Let me start with expressing my deep concerns and shock with the scandal of the data leak that Afghans entrusted the British government with their data. That data was very crucial for the enemy to target these allies. From the start, the Operation Pitting had its failure. Yes, a number of lives were saved. There were a few who have been killed. There are some who have been arrested, disappeared, and tortured. And we never
Sorry, Rafi. This is the absolutely central, most important point in all of this. The Rimmer report has said that essentially people are now safe in Afghanistan. People who worked with the British are now fine. There will be no reprisals against them. From your knowledge, is that true?
No, that's not true. There have been cases where allies have been disappeared, killed, tortured. For months they were put in prison, beaten, ransom money was taken from the family, and they were threatened not to come out and speak to the media or report it anywhere. We didn't know how the Taliban are finding these people. Now with this leak, we have it's bringing the picture together that the information that the Taliban were easily targeting these people, they had access to that information, and however they got it, they have got it. So
that's very worrying. Rafi, can I just ask you to explain to people listening your own story? You were a translator, yes, with British forces?
Yes. Yes, I was a translator with the British forces, and I'd come to UK in July 2011, and I run a campaign for the Afghan interpreters, and before the collapse, a few hundred interpreters and their families were moved here to the UK. And with the collapse, I continued with my campaign, and other allied groups were added to those schemes.
And Rafi, what about your own family? Are you concerned about them? You still have family in Afghanistan?
Yes, I do have family members in Afghanistan. Although a majority of family have been moved here to the UK, but I still have got some family members left in Afghanistan. Having said this, I wanted to add a separate story of one of the brother of a 333 officer who has been killed last Friday.
I'm sorry, Rafi. You should explain that 333 were the volunteer Afghan special forces who worked with the British, yes?
Yes.
Right. So somebody connected to one of those.
Well, I'm not saying that it was directly connected to the league. What I'm trying to say is that the brother, the 333 officer is here in the UK. However, his brother, who had nothing to do with the former government, neither with the 333 or the British forces, suddenly the Taliban come and shoot him in close to his home, and he is killed. I spoke to the family member, the brother who is here in the UK, and I was told that the Taliban have been looking for him, and every time his brother have shown or expressed his not knowing anything about his brother. And so now the Taliban, I think, in a revenge, has killed his brother. So how did they find out who this person was, whose brother he was? We don't know. And I'm not saying directly that I was somehow related to the league, but the Taliban had access to the information of our family members, the roles that we have played, the jobs that we have carried out for the British forces.
Well, I'm joined now by the Minister for the Armed Forces, Luke Pollard. Mr. Pollard, thank you very much indeed. John Healey said in the House of Commons that the risk of retaliation by the Taliban was much, much less, but not zero, not nothing. And we've just heard an account there of the brother of somebody involved in the Afghan volunteer forces working alongside with the British, was murdered very recently by the Taliban. It being a bit safer but not safe, that's not really good enough, is it?
No, I mean, Afghanistan remains a dangerous country. Upon starting in government, we were uncomfortable with the threat assessment and the super-injunction that was in place, which is why we commissioned an independent report to look at the experience on the ground, what the Taliban were doing, what information they had access to, as well as trying to fix what was, frankly, a mess of a relocation system that we had inherited.
Yeah.
What we do know is that the Taliban have access to a lot of information already. Biometrics data, pay records, passport data, a lot of information. And that helps inform our decision that enabled us to take a different assessment. That doesn't mean Afghanistan is a safe place for everyone. That is certainly not the case. But it doesn't our assessment of the information meant that it doesn't necessarily mean that they're at increased risk because they were on the data set that the Ministry of Defence lost in 2022. And that's why we've been able to take the different decisions, including giving information to the court that has enabled them to lift the super-injunction. So all of this can be made public.
I am not suggesting that the murder that Rafi was just describing to us was caused by the data leak. We can't possibly know that. But we do know that some 25,000 people or so have come here through this new scheme as a result of the data leak. And that suggests that 750,000 people are still in Afghanistan and might have been identified. Are you absolutely sure that the Rimmer inquiry or the Rimmer report is safe in terms of their safety?
We are, but Andrew, I don't think those figures you just cited are correct there. So when this response route that the last government put in place will be fully completed, based on the announcements we've made today, there'll be 6,900 extra people in the UK because of that data leak. That will cost broadly around £850 million. That's the consequence of that data leak from 2022. But what we have done is to make any changes in this, to satisfy ourselves that the situation we inherited could change and should change, we've had to look closely and long and hard at the threat assessment, at the information about what the Taliban is doing, what information they have access to, whether they are systematically going after people who worked for the former Afghan government. The assessment from that independent review is that there is no heightened threat by being on that data set, information that Taliban probably already know about who worked for the former administration. That is why we've been able to take these decisions today.
Luke, can I ask you two other things quickly? The person responsible for this catastrophic mistake, and I think catastrophic is a fair word to use, are they still employed by the MOD? And if so, what do you have to do there to get fired?
Well, our assessment, looking back on what is available, because not all the information from the last government is available to a new government, as you will know, due to the protocols of not sharing advice given to a former minister to a current one, means that our focus has been quite correctly on what is happening today rather than the consequences of re-litigating effectively what happened in 2022. Our assessment is...
To be honest, Luke, that sounds astonishing.
Oh, absolutely. This is an unprecedented and really serious data leak. But our understanding from at the time, the investigation that the Metropolitan Police, when they looked into this matter, they concluded that no criminal investigation was required, that it was accidental. My word, it's had serious consequences.
Yeah,
but it was accidental.
This person is still working with you today. Final question. This super-injunction itself, as you know, has been hugely controversial. Can you promise people listening the British government is not going to use this mechanism again?
It's certainly not something that I would ever want used again in this respect. The experience that I've seen since becoming a minister as the consequences, meaning that as a minister, as a parliamentarian, I wasn't able to raise any of these issues on the floor of the House. That journalists who had awareness of it wasn't able to scrutinise the work of government. That the previous government created a secret relocation route, spending hundreds of millions of pounds on it. But this is something that sits not just uncomfortably with me as a parliamentarian, someone who believes in freedom of speech and parliamentary accountability. It's something that is complete anathema to the way that I think we should be doing our politics. Having said that, I don't believe the decisions taken by the previous Conservative administration were done in bad faith. I think there were a set of very, very difficult decisions that they had to take. Equally, as arguing to lift the injunction is also a difficult set of decisions for the current set of ministers here.
All right, Luke Pollard, thank you very much indeed for talking to LBC tonight. Now, up next, we've got news of a potential government resignation. And on the day this country was described as a powder keg of social tensions, we'll hear from a former Defence Secretary about the rise of anti-Semitism in the UK. Tonight, you're listening to Tonight with Andrew Marr. Time now, 6:19.
This is LBC.
Last.
Tonight with Andrew Marr. Watch live on both Global Player and the new LBC app.
6:21, and now to another defence-related story, and a very important one. A huge row is brewing over the government's determination to change the law, giving a conditional amnesty for suspects in historic cases of killings during the Northern Ireland Troubles. The Northern Ireland Secretary, Hilary Benn, argues it's wrong because it bans families of victims for pursuing new inquests or looking for compensation in the courts, and he's going to abolish immunity for suspects. Trouble is, that includes British Army veterans who asked why soldiers would carry out orders in the future if they thought they might end up in court. There have been reports that Alistair Cairns, the Veterans Minister, and himself, a former Royal Marines Commando, one of the most decorated soldiers ever to sit in the House of Commons, is contemplating resigning if the government goes ahead. I'm joined now by one of those commissioners, David Johnstone, the Northern Ireland Veterans Commissioner, who has expressed his support for the Veterans Minister. Very good to have you in the studio.
Good to be here.
Can I ask, first of all, as it were, for you to swivel round and explain why the government would change this rule at all?
Well, the argument they're putting forward is that the Legacy Act allowed for immunity for not only for British soldiers, but also for the terrorists. And in the debate yesterday, which I attended, frequent government speakers referred to this morality about giving terrorists some type of immunity. So that is the argument they're putting forward. I don't think it holds water. It doesn't hold water with veterans because it was a Labour government back in 1998, certainly had no moral qualms about opening the prison doors, letting out over 400 terrorists, giving comfort letters to those who had committed the most heinous crimes. So the morality argument doesn't wash with veterans.
Whereas the soldiers were, as everybody has said, following orders, trying to protect the rest of us, and they were involved in highly controversial cases. But these are people now very often in their 60s and 70s and even older.
Yes, and that's very much the point. You know, British soldiers were sent to Northern Ireland by the government. They followed lawful orders. Some of the operations like Clonaux, like Loughgall, like Coke, to name three, they were given orders. They were given rules of engagement. They followed those rules of engagement. Subsequent to those operations, there were investigations already. So these incidents have already been through scrutiny. Every bullet fired by a soldier in Northern Ireland is accounted for. So you're absolutely right. This sort of retrospective look at these instances from all these years ago, it's immoral because the law that's been applied, the ECHR, only came into effect in the United Kingdom in 2000. And yet soldiers have been held to account for actions they were lawfully ordered to do retrospectively. That should not be happening.
Now, you're in touch, obviously, with veterans communities and veterans around the country. There's a huge demonstration the other day of veterans with their motorbikes and so on coming around Westminster Square and making their feelings very strongly felt. What do you think the reaction is generally through the community of army people, ex-army people in Britain?
Yeah, so I think it's important to perhaps make a slight distinction between the veterans in Northern Ireland and those in England, Scotland and Wales. In this sense, the vast majority of soldiers who may well be caught up if this line of prosecution is reopened do not live in Northern Ireland. So there is a real sense of veterans across GB of wondering, will they be caught up in this? For those veterans in Northern Ireland, there's perhaps the angle of the politics of the Troubles and certainly the rewriting of history and the not recognising of their service very much exercises them.
You must know Alistair Cairns quite well, very, very highly respected Veterans Minister. It's reported that he is on resignation watch. Do you think that's likely?
Well, certainly Al would not discuss with me what his personal plans are. What I can say is that I do speak to Al regularly. He's held in the highest esteem by the veteran community. I've put him in front of veterans in Northern Ireland and they were very impressed with him. I could say we're very much aligned on our views on the current proposals, particularly around safeguarding of veterans. That is very important to him. So I'm not surprised that the reports say he's considering his future because he's a man of integrity and I know he wants to do the best for veterans. And if he feels he cannot do that or he's not been listened to, I wouldn't be surprised if he does consider his future.
A very dangerous moment for the government. David Johnstone, thank you very much indeed for coming in and talking to me. Let me quote something now, written jointly by a Labour politician, John Mann, the former MP, Lord Mann now, and the former Tory Defence Secretary, Penny Mordaunt. We are hard-nosed politicians. We are not shrinking violets who run around being easily offended, and we're used to dealing with the extremes of human emotions and catastrophe through our parliamentary casework in the past. Even with decades of these experiences, we were still stunned into silence by the evidence that we received as independent chairs of the Board of Deputies Commission on Anti-Semitism, particularly from young people in the Jewish community. Penny Mordaunt is with me now. Penny, that was quite the statement.
Yes, I mean, it was. We did a very open call for evidence about what it is like being a Jewish person living in all parts of the UK. And our commission went where the evidence took us. And there's been a great deal of focus on protests and policing, but not a lot of focus on civil society. And so it's the everyday experiences of Jewish people that we heard in that evidence. And a lot of it was very shocking.
Penny, just sort of give people a sense of what you heard. People listening, this is people at work, presumably students at universities. Just what kinds of things were you being told?
So a lot of it in work settings. We did find good practice, but unfortunately in certain professions, for example, if you're a teacher or a social worker and you have to be a member of a particular professional body or a particular union, you need insurance and indemnity to actually work. If you're going to your local branch meeting and you're abused and you're spat on, but you have to engage with those organisations, that shouldn't be happening in the UK. Another example was a Jewish student who has disabilities and was completely reliant on the university welfare officer for her place at university, for the money she needed to study there. She watched that welfare officer leave a protest calling for the annihilation of Jews, walk across the courtyard, come and sit at her desk in front of this girl and ask her for her medical records. These things have become normalised and acceptable. And what we're doing is saying this shouldn't be happening in this day and age. We've given 10 very practical recommendations. They're extremists all over the place, but the large bulk of people are just doing things because they're not thinking about them. They're not thinking about how wearing a particular badge, for example, if they're an NHS receptionist, might cause someone to feel uncomfortable about the procedure they're about to have.
Well, I was talking to somebody involved in the NHS who said, for instance, wearing a Palestine badge, if you're going in to look after an elderly Jewish person, might cause, offence. That's the kind of thing we're talking about here.
Yes, there's lots of examples, but I think if we get some of those basic things right, it will help us tackle some of the more extreme examples as well.
Now, you were Defence Secretary back in 2019, before this Afghan war came to an end, the scuttle took place. But what's your reaction to what you've heard today?
Well, as well as the emotions that you spoke about in your introductory monologue, the other thing I'm thinking about today is really parliamentary scrutiny. And I have long advocated that we have a particular committee in Parliament called the Intelligence and Security Committee, which is confidential. It's not in the public domain, and it has people on it which are senior people, very trusted, and it tends to take evidence from our intelligence agencies. And I've always felt that for certain things like special forces operations and things which are highly confidential, but you would want Parliament to know about them, but they can't be discussed on the floor of the House, that committee ought to scrutinise some of these things. So I think one of the disturbing elements of this, and there are many, is that Parliament was not cited on this at all. And I think a bit of parliamentary scrutiny often helps keep governments honest about what they're doing and allows a bit of scrutiny as to question why they're taking particular courses of action.
Thinking about going forward, the person responsible for this appalling, catastrophic breach, which has caused lots and lots of people to fear for their lives, even if they haven't actually been killed, and had to come quickly to the United Kingdom with all the costs of that. Nothing has happened, and there is a sense the Ministry of Defence in particular has a series of failures and nobody seems ever to be held accountable for them.
Well, look, in defence of ministers, I feel a bit of lawyer-itis here, that they've been told not to say anything about a particular individual. What I would say is that the reason why it's important that we do right by the interpreters, that we want to demonstrate to people who might be partners in the future that we can be trusted, that they can work with us in this way. The same argument applies to somebody that might still be doing things in the Ministry of Defence. This is about restoring trust and confidence. So I don't think that person should be employed by the MOD. I think this is, in part, this is about resetting this and saying, this is wrong. We need to have trust and confidence about going forward.
Penny, you're very popular with the military, always have been as a politician in the past. I don't know what you know of Alistair Cairns, but a very well-decorated, very well-respected Member of Parliament. Do you think that he's likely to, looking at what we've heard about what's going to happen to veterans of the Northern Ireland conflict, do you think he'd be right to resign?
I know Al Cairns very well because he was my military assistant when I was Secretary of State for Defence. And what I would say is the government needs to listen to its Veterans Minister. He's a decent man, but he's also a very sensible man. And it's not just about the moral rights and wrongs of this. This is about our reputation. And I really do think, I've been campaigning on the issue that was debated on Monday. I've been promoting the petition. It is absolutely right. We leave things as they are. It was very painful at the time. I remember the Northern Ireland Minister at the time, at one stage being in tears from having met families who were feeling aggrieved about the changes that we were making. But it is the right thing to do.
I think a lot of veterans will be listening to you and nodding very vigorously. Penny Mordaunt, thank you so much for coming in.
Thank you.
The Chancellor is preparing for her Mansion House speech this evening as we all wait to hear her economic vision as the government goes for growth again. Well, what can we expect? What should we be doing? What should she be doing? We'll be discussing all of that in a few minutes, but the time now, 6:32, and Amelia Cox has your news headlines.
A former Afghan interpreter has told LBC he believes the Taliban have used a major data breach at the MOD to target people who helped Britain. The Defence Secretary has apologised after revealing the personal details of thousands of people seeking safety in the UK were leaked. The two men who cut down the Sycamore Gap tree have each been jailed for 4 years and 3 months. 39-year-old Daniel Graham and Adam Carruthers, who's 32, was convicted of criminal damage in May. And 3 women have been arrested on suspicion of terror offences after a van was driven into a defence factory in Edinburgh. It happened at a premises which makes components for Israel's F-35 fighter jets earlier. LBC weather, heavy showers lingering over central and eastern England tonight. Light rain in the southwest, but generally dry elsewhere. A low of 8 degrees.
This is LBC.
Availability.
Tonight with Andrew Marr. Listen on your smart speaker. Just say, play LBC.
6:35. Well, of course, tonight has been dominated by that extraordinary data leak story about the Afghan veterans, and you have been getting in touch. I'm going to read you two things. Jim sent this via WhatsApp, and he says, I fought in Afghanistan alongside an Afghan interpreter who'd supported us for decades at war. We'd drive around and find dead bodies with Taliban flags as a warning to anyone who worked with us. The cost of resettling Afghan nationals is chicken feed, considering the fact that the war cost around £37 billion. Not that I agree with injunctions and the Official Secrets Act when the government hide information from democracy. And David says, why are the people at LBC surprised at this story? I'm not. I wouldn't trust the British government over anything. They, the politicians and the senior civil servants, are completely self-serving. We'll get sorry and lessons will be learned. Pathetic that anyone would believe them. Thanks, David. Right, let's turn to the other big subject of the night, because tonight the Chancellor, Rachel Reeves, has one of her big moments of the year, the Mansion House speech, where she sets out her thinking to city grandees. It comes on a day when she's already unveiled her so-called Leeds reforms to boost financial services, cutting the costs of accountability for senior bankers, for instance, an advertising blitz to get us investing more cash in British stocks, and much else. Well, let's hope she enjoys herself tonight, because hanging over all of this is weak economic growth and the prospect of higher taxes to try to make the books balance this autumn. Our political correspondent, Aggie Chambré, is here with that and more details of what we can expect. But first, Aggie, let's talk about Alistair Cairns, that Veterans Minister, and those reports, those suggestions that he's about to resign.
Indeed. So this all seems to have come from a meeting that happened last Monday, where the Northern Ireland Secretary Hilary Benn met with a number of Labour MPs, including Alistair Cairns, who, of course, is the Veterans Minister. And I'm told, I've spoken to people who were in that meeting, I'm told that there was worry, anger, about the repealing of this legislation. Alistair Cairns was, of course, one of the people who brought that up. And the MP, one of the MPs that I spoke to about this, basically said, look, it didn't sound to me like he was about to resign, but it also sounded to me like he had been in conversation with the Northern Ireland Secretary for quite some time, and they were kind of going back and forth on this. But as I say, there is concern. The Ministry of Defence tonight are playing this down. Someone else suggested to me that the Times had over-reported it by suggesting he was about to resign. But obviously, in listening to your programme too, it does sound like he is extremely unhappy. But as one senior Labour MP said to me, because it's worth pointing out, repealing this legislation was in the manifesto for the Labour Party. This is not a surprise.
On which Alistair Cairns stood.
On which he stood, and also he accepted this job on that basis. And as this person said to me, this is the most controversial part of the brief, and you accepted this job. So this senior Labour MP said to me, it's outrageous, and also pointed to the fact that Sir Keir Starmer, the Prime Minister, went to Northern Ireland, he met victims, and he told them that he was going to repeal the Act. So this has not come as a surprise to anyone. But speaking to people today, it does sound like this may be yet another thing that Labour MPs are greatly divided on with the government, and there is a huge amount of worry, and they just don't know exactly where they're going to end up.
Very interesting. And quickly, Aggie, can you give us a sense of what we're likely to get from the Chancellor later on?
Indeed, I can. So it's going to be a lot of cutting regulation. I can tell you now what she's going to say is regulation still acts as a boot on the neck of business, choking off the enterprise and innovation that is the lifeblood of growth. So yet again, Andrew, all about growth.
Very strong growth metaphors as ever, Aggie. Thank you very much indeed. And it's easy to go, yah, boo, not going so very well, is it, Chancellor? And that is true, but I like to find constructive suggestions in these dire times, and to help me, I'm joined next by the freshly minted, new this week Director of the Institute for Fiscal Studies, Helen Miller. I wanted to know what she thought the Chancellor should be doing that she is not currently doing.
Well, I think one thing is worth saying that she's already put lots of money into investment, and it's really important we have to deliver on that now. So we have the money there, we have the plans, delivering on the infrastructure is going to be really important in actually getting that growth going. We'll hear later from the Mansion House what she's going to do in the financial sector. It's one of the 8 sectors she got that she wants to promote. The details there are going to matter. So again, working out how you can deregulate in a way that's pro-growth, but not too risky, that's going to matter. And there's a whole other set of things she could do. So for example, one thing I've talked lots about is tax reform, the fact that that's been taken off the table so far. And in my mind, I think we should be throwing the kitchen sink at the growth mission, and therefore that tax reform should come back onto the table.
tax is exactly what I want to talk about, because obviously there's lots of speculation about wealth taxes, this tax, that tax, coming in the autumn. But we have one of the biggest, sort of thickest tax books anywhere in the world. It's an incredibly complicated set of taxes. What do you think she should do? Is there a case for simply removing huge numbers of tax exemptions and making the whole thing much simpler?
Yes, I think she certainly should be looking at big reforms. I think just tinkering around the edges, you can get some more money. But she's raising something like, £1,100 billion in tax. How she raises that is going to be much more important than whether or how she raises a few more tens of billions. So I think you can literally look at any part of the tax system, and there's things you could do that would make it better. Just to pick one random example, but there really are very many. Take VAT. We spend about 100 billion on reliefs in VAT. You could get rid of those, increase universal credit to help people on the lowest incomes, cut the VAT rate, and have income money to spare. So I think you need something that's be big and radical and not just tinkering. Let's just stick with VAT for a second, because are there areas of VAT that you think should go, not necessarily VAT zero rated, but exemptions to VAT that you think are a bit crackers? I think all of them are a bit crackers, honestly. I think it's really hard to justify any of them. A lot of them are justified on this basis of, take exemptions for food or children's clothing, that they're going to help poorer people. But actually, most of the money is spent on richer people who spend more money overall on food and clothes. So I think they're just not very well targeted at achieving those aims. I think the problem with just picking out a few of them to change is that if you picked out children's clothing, for example, it looks very targeted. We had the pasty tax years ago, right? You tried to change the pasty tax, that was just on shambles, you couldn't do it. Whereas the VAT rate went up a lot, and that was fine. So I think rather than trying to pick out individual things that look very targeted, doing something big and say, look, we're just getting rid of exemptions and reliefs, we're going to lower the rate, we're going to do something else. I think bigger is almost easier in some ways. There's a lot of people in the media and in politics over the road who seem to be terrified by the possibility of some great big wealth tax. Do you think she's going to go for that? I suspect not myself. I suspect not too, and partly just for a very practical reason, that the government doesn't currently collect information on people's wealth. It would be a huge effort to just go and work out and value wealth, and some wealth's pretty easy to value. Some wealth, like private businesses, is actually very hard to value. So it would be a big, administrative deal to even get this off the ground. I think much more likely that you look at the tax we've already got than have a big new one, honestly. And she's made these promises. It's very difficult for a politician who has made promises like that in an election campaign to U-turn. Do you think she should simply get up and say, look, the world's changed, I'm really, really sorry, I can't keep my promise on, for instance, income tax? So I'm on record saying I think it was a mistake even before the election to promise those things, because even if you don't want to increase them, you never know what's going to happen. And there are things you might want to do in the reform space. That means you might want to put some rates up, some rates down, even if you don't increase revenue overall. So in some ways, I'd love her to stand up and say, look, do you know what? Here's a reform agenda. We're going to do something big and bold to really move the dial on growth and maybe raise some more revenue along the way. I think that would be a better strategy. I think what's not going to work wonderfully for it is if it just says, I need some more revenue, here I'll put this tax up and break this pledge. There's not really a good news story there. I think it would be easier to go bigger and say, look, I'm going to do a big set of things in the tax reform return system, which could mean some things go up, some things go down, but for a principled reason. And the good thing about that is you get growth out of it. Let me give you a principle then. What about equalising taxation on investments and taxation on income? So I think that's one where the nuance really matters here. So I think the government needs to do two things. So I think one is that they need to look at the kind of the tax base, so the reliefs you get. And currently we have this silly situation where you have low rates for investment income, but at the same time you have reliefs that discourage savings and investment. So you need to do two things. You need to do some technical changes to the tax base, which are a bit in the weeds, but basically stop those taxes disincentivising saving and investment. Once you've done that and you reform the tax, then I think there's a very clear case for equalising across different kinds of income. But if you just do the equalisation first, then you have a trade-off. You get more revenue, but you've discouraged saving. People stop investing, and we want people to invest in shares, and particularly in British companies. Absolutely. Helen, let's turn to housing, because that's something that people talk about a lot. Clearly, council tax hasn't been revalued for a very, very long time, and there are big injustices in terms of how much people in wealthy parts of London pay versus people in poorer parts of the northeast of England, for instance. So is there a case at looking again at the entire housing taxation? Absolutely, yeah. There's a very clear case for looking at it again. I mean, the government wants to build more houses. It should also be thinking about the allocation of the current stock of houses we have. So I think you've mentioned council tax. It's regressive, so people in higher value properties pay less as a share of that property. That's very hard to justify. I think at least making it proportional will be better. So yeah, I'd revalue council tax, make it at least proportional. That could be a tax rise for some and a tax cut for others. And you could do it as part of a package that also scraps stamp duty. Stamp duty is an awful tax, really pernicious. It gums up the housing market, it stops people from moving house. Stopping doing that would be pro-growth. I think a part of a package could be fairer and better for growth.
So in terms of stamp duty, for instance, you're talking about things like older people in a big house, which could accommodate many more people wanting to downsize, and yet stamp duty makes it too expensive for them to do so. That's
Absolutely.
The kind of perversity.
Yeah, and similarly, young families in a house that's too small for them, but sort of hanging on to make sure they can make the bigger move because they know they can't move 2 or 3 times, so they can't afford the stamp duty. And it's not about forcing people to move when they don't want to. It's about saying people want to move, but you're putting in place a huge disincentive to do that moving. And stopping people from moving is bad for people.
Well, I don't know if the Chancellor is spending her afternoon with a cup of tea listening to LBC, but if she has, lots of very helpful suggestions for her there, Helen Miller. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
So why is Rachel Reeves focusing particularly on reforms to the City of London? And what might they bring to those of us who aren't city slickers? Isn't deregulation of finance a bit dangerous? Isn't that what we learned after the financial crash? Let's hear from Susannah Streeter, Head of Money and Markets at Hargreaves Landsdown. Susannah, thanks very much for joining us tonight. I guess that's the fundamental question. Why is it looking at city deregulation? Why is that a high importance priority for the Chancellor?
Well, there's been quite a lot of hand-wringing about the fact that London's losing out to Wall Street. I mean, London struggled to compete with the superstar valuations of those tech giants and has been facing an exodus of listed firms leaving for pastures new. So the city needs a bit of a leg up. And so these measures are attempting to provide support by making it cheaper and easier to raise funding in London. And crucially, keep companies here in the UK. So they are generating revenue, they're generating that growth, they're generating jobs, and certainly generating the tax take for the government. And companies have long bemoaned the difficulties of raising money in this kind of tangle of red tape, which the shake-up being announced today is designed to cut through. So we've got lots of different measures, for example, changes in prospectus rules, make it easier for companies to list. But then this launching of the retail investment campaign to get ordinary investors fired up about investing for their longer term resilience as well.
I am old enough to remember interviewing Gordon Brown about whether there had been sufficient regulation of the city before the big crash in 2007, 2008. Is there a parallel here?
Well, yes. I mean, I certainly remember pulling all-nighters trying to work out what Gordon Brown and Mervyn King were going to do to try and save the economy because, of course, there had been kind of too much casino-style trading and dealing and repackaging lots of loans and reselling them. And that caused and sparked the financial crisis with all of those repercussions. And after that, there was these guardrails put in fence, ring fencing to essentially protect depositors' money. Now, what's being mooted is that this ring fencing could be relaxed because some of the big banks are saying it actually traps capital that actually could be put to greater use and lending out to consumers and all sorts of things. So what's happening is that the Bank of England are going to review this. Now, I don't foresee that there's going to be a really big loosening, but more like tinkering around the edges of this because not everybody is really on board with this. The boss of Barclays has come out to say actually protecting depositors' money is absolutely crucial.
Well, we'll just have to cross our fingers that the Chancellor has got this one right. Susannah, thank you very much indeed for talking to me. Coming up, good news for people looking to get their hands on an electric car and the sentencing of the 2 men who cut down one of the most iconic trees in the country. But the time now is 6:49.
Coming up at 7, Ian Dale leading Britain's conversation.
The public reaction was outstanding, really. We had thousands of emails between ourselves and our partners at the National Trust. We quickly created a partnership and went through all of those emails, personally read them, and there was everything from people recalling their memories there. Some people scattered the ashes of their loved ones there. Some people got engaged there. Some people also recalled some of their children's first steps at the sycamore gap tree. It really was a backdrop to people's lives. And with that, when the tree was felled, people kind of felt that those memories were taken away from them with it. So they really felt, strong feelings of loss and upset.
Now, what we do know is that, unlike people, trees can have a certain amount of life after death. And I gather that, there are branches beginning to grow from the tree already, though it may take another 150 years for it to grow to the same height again. So there is some kind of hope there. Has it become a kind of negative tourist place? In other words, people want to go and see the stump, they want to go and remember it. Is it still a place that people go to?
I think people want to see the regrowth. So there's some hopeful stories coming out of it. If anything, it's reminded people how important nature and landscape are to us and our communities. And so people are coming to visit the stump and the regrowth around the stump. We're really, really happy that there's some green shoots there, and our National Park Ranger, Gary, was the one who found them. But we also have an art installation opening at the Searle National Landscape Discovery Centre, which is an installation by artist Charlie Winnie, which is the largest part of the trunk. So people can go and see that and reconnect with that. And it's a beautiful installation made up primarily of the words that people sent. And then the National Trust actually took some of the seeds and have grown what we're calling trees of hope. So the sycamore lives on in its offspring, and they're going to kind of key community places around the whole of the UK, where those sycamore trees can offer different charities, community groups, places of hope. So yeah, we're calling those the trees of hope, and you'll hear more about those in the autumn.
Well, it does strike me that the sycamore probably had a higher IQ than the two idiots who cut it down. But I also note that Hadrian's Wall itself was damaged in all of this. Has that been reconstructed, rebuilt, so that it's the same as before? I mean, this is one of the greatest monuments anywhere in the United Kingdom.
Yeah, so the conservation work led by Historic England has been done on Hadrian's Wall, and that's why it's such an important site. As you say, it's a UNESCO World Heritage Site. It's in Northumberland National Park, and it's on National Trust land. So, and it also sits on the Hadrian's Wall National Trail. So there's lots of important factors to that place, and we've all been doing our best to kind of work together to create the best outcome for the site, really. And we believe the best outcome for the site itself is to let nature kind of grow back, and that's what those kind of new sprouts and hope are. And therefore, we're not damaging the wall further. And we also believe that people want to reconnect with the tree and visit the site, but also do that through the art installation I told you about. So it's been a really busy 18 months for all of those organisations working closely together.
Well, Rosie, it reminds me of the old Chitty Chitty Bang Bang song about from the ashes of disaster grow the roses of success. The very best wishes to you all up there. Thank you very, very much indeed for talking to me. Now then, do you like some good news? Are you ready for some good news? I'm sure you are. So, the air is getting cleaner. A study by Reading University has found that levels of nitrogen dioxide are down 35%. That's the asthma gas that comes out of car engines and gas boilers. So less of that. And much the same story with the tiny particles emitted by wood-burning stoves and car tyres and smokestacks. Again, the kind of pollution we mostly don't notice, but is very, very important. It can cause cancer, for instance, in adults who don't smoke. So, thus far, good news. But it's partly down to the growing but slowing fashion for electric vehicles. And the other news today is that grants to encourage people to switch to an EV of £3,750 are coming back. Not for the most expensive ones and not for the Chinese cars. You won't get it for a Tesla or a BYD or a Flash Merc, but there's a lot of others to choose from. Let's talk now to Robert Llewelyn, who's the founder of the Fully Charged Show, the world's #1 electric vehicle channel. Robert, are you there?
I am here, yes. Thank you.
Excellent, Robert. Now, when you look at the numbers of EVs, they're still pretty tiny in terms of proportion. 1.5 million, I think, on the roads at the moment, as opposed to around 30 million petrol and diesel cars. There is something bigger here than just the lack of a subsidy, isn't there?
I think it's pretty impressive. I'm absolutely amazed that there's 1.5 million electric cars. There's been a constant lot of negative publicity in some of the British press about the advantages of electric cars. Not that that's made that big a difference. I mean, the one area of new car sales that's gone up is electric ones in the last couple of years, and the increase in second-hand electric car sales has increased by, it's like ridiculous amount, like 500%. But that is because a lot of electric cars have come onto the second-hand market recently, which is a new thing. But I think this
some people say some people say the batteries deteriorate, and therefore the second-hand market isn't quite what it should be.
I mean, I wonder who these some people are, because the one thing we've now learnt after, 15 years of driving around in electric cars, which I've been, is the batteries last longer than the car. And it's certainly in future, cars that are being built now, the cars will have all kinds of mechanical issues with suspension, with steering, with brakes, but the battery will be fine. So the whole myth about the batteries wearing out and you have to replace the batteries, it just isn't. That isn't the factual. It doesn't happen.
And the final, blindingly obvious question is about the number of chargers. Are we beginning to get to a situation where almost everybody who's got an electric car can safely drive around the country and find a charger?
Yes, I think that is not a problem, and it's becoming a much less of a problem day by day. The real challenge is for people who don't have somewhere off the street to park a car. That is a bigger challenge for them. There's less advantage in having an electric car if you do that. But that said, I know a lot of people, I work with two of them, who live in terraced houses and have electric cars, and they survive very adequately. But I mean, I quickly want to say that 60% of British homes have somewhere off the street to park a car, which means 60% of us could easily take huge advantage of having an electric vehicle.
Indeed, Robert Llewelyn, and the air is sweeter too. I'll be back with you tomorrow. If you've missed any of today's show, you can listen back on both Global Player and the LBC app, where you can read and watch the latest from LBC. Download the official LBC app for free from your app store now. Coming up at 10 on LBC, Henry Riley. But right now, it's time for Ian Dale.
Andrew, thank you very much indeed. Well, at 8 o'clock, it's not going to be a cross-question today. That's going to be at 9 o'clock. The reason, Kemi Badenoch, the Conservative Party leader, she's coming into the studio for an hour from 8 to take your calls. At 9 o'clock on cross-question, Luke Murphy, the Labour MP for Basingstoke, Andrew Griffith, the Conservative Shadow Business Secretary and MP for Arundel and South Downs, Reem Ibrahim, Communications Manager at the Institute of Economic Affairs, and LBC's political correspondent, Aggie Chambré. But first, we're going to be joined by